It might sound strange, but I sometimes find myself thinking about the fact that we're currently living in an ice age. Not just a cold snap, but a full-blown ice age that began about 2.6 million years ago. And the truly mind-bending part, every 100,000 years, like clockwork, massive ice sheets advance, covering huge portions of continents, only to melt away again. It's a cycle that has shaped the very evolution of life on Earth. But why 100,000 years? What's so special about that particular number? As I've come to learn, it has everything to do with how Earth wobbles through space. And the story of figuring all of this out is, in itself, pretty incredible. When Earth tips into a full glacial period, the planet becomes home to some of the most bizarre and magnificent creatures imaginable. Woolly mammoths trudging through frozen grasslands come to mind, as do giant ground sloths digging tunnels the size of houses, and saber-toothed cats hunting prey that weighed several tons. About 10,000 years ago, most of these incredible animals simply vanished. The cycle shifted, the ice melted, and suddenly the megafauna that had dominated the planet for hundreds of thousands of years couldn't make it. The question of why, whether it was climate change, humans, or both, is still debated. So, in this journey, I want to explore this 100,000-year cycle, how it works, why it happens, and what kind of world it creates during the cold phases, and what happens when it shifts back to warm. We'll meet the creatures that thrived in Ice Age conditions, learn how humans survived and adapted, and understand why it all came crashing down so recently. And finally, we'll consider where we are in the cycle right now and what that might mean for our future. Let's start with the basics. An ice age isn't just a cold period. It's an extended chunk of time, millions of years, where Earth's temperature drops enough that massive ice sheets and glaciers take over large portions of the planet's surface. We're currently in one, the Pleistocene Ice Age, which kicked off about 2.6 million years ago and technically hasn't ended yet. Within any ice age, there are fluctuations. There are glacial periods where it's really frozen and interglacial periods where it warms up. We're in an interglacial period right now and have been for about 11,700 years. So when people say the Ice Age, they usually mean the last glacial period, which lasted from about 115,000 years ago to 11,700 years ago. That's when the ice sheets were at their biggest and the megafauna were running the show. During that last glacial period, the temperature was only about 6 degrees Celsius colder than today on average. 6 degrees doesn't sound like much, right? But we're not talking about 6 degrees in one spot. We're talking about 6 degrees worth of thermal energy being sucked out of the entire planet, all the oceans, all the land masses, the whole atmosphere. That's enough to completely transform the world. Huge ice sheets covered most of Canada and northern Europe. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America and the Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe were kilometers thick in some places. Because so much water was locked up in ice, sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. You could walk from England to France. You could stroll from Asia to Alaska across what's now the Bering Strait. The coastlines were completely different, and the landscape was mostly tundra and cold grasslands, dry and windswept, nothing like the forests we see today. So what caused this? Why does Earth go through these dramatic swings every 100,000 years? The answer starts with a Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovitch. Back in the early 1900s, he figured out something nobody else had really considered. What if ice ages weren't caused by anything happening on Earth, but by changes in Earth's position relative to the Sun? Earth's orbit isn't perfectly circular, it's slightly elliptical. The shape of that ellipse changes over time because of gravitational pulls from other planets, mainly Jupiter and Saturn. Sometimes our orbit is more circular, sometimes it's more stretched out. This cycle of changing from circular to elliptical and back takes about 100,000 years. That's the first Milankovitch cycle, called eccentricity. When Earth's orbit is highly elliptical, the distance between Earth and the Sun varies more dramatically throughout the year. This affects how much solar radiation hits different parts of the planet at different times. And here's the crucial part. It's not about how much total sunlight Earth gets. It's about where and when that sunlight hits. Northern Hemisphere summers are the key, because that's where most of the land is. If Northern Hemisphere summers are cool enough that winter snow doesn't fully melt, the snow sticks around. Year after year, it piles up. Eventually, you've got ice sheets forming. And once ice sheets start growing, they reflect more sunlight back into space, which cools things down even more, which allows more ice to form. It's a runaway feedback loop. But eccentricity isn't the only cycle. There's also obliquity, which is the tilt of Earth's axis. The more tilted Earth is, the more extreme the seasons. This tilt varies on a roughly 41,000-year cycle. When Earth is less tilted, the difference between summer and winter is milder, which means summer might not be warm enough to melt all the winter ice. Ice accumulates, and an ice age begins. The third cycle is precession, or wobble. Earth wobbles on its axis like I sometimes forget just how delicately balanced our planet is. It's easy to think of Earth as this solid, stable thing, but it's really more like a spinning top that's starting to slow down. And as it slows, the wobble changes which hemisphere tilted toward the Sun during different parts of its orbit. It's a cycle that takes about 26,000 years. This, of course, affects the contrast between the seasons. Right now, the Northern Hemisphere experiences winter when Earth is closest to the Sun, making our winters milder than they could be. But this isn't always the case. The precession cycle means that Northern Hemisphere winters can become much colder. When you combine these cycles, eccentricity, obliquity, and precession, they work together to control Earth's long-term climate. What I find so strange is that the 100,000-year eccentricity cycle is actually the weakest of the three in terms of how much it changes incoming solar radiation. You'd think the other two would matter more. Yet, when scientists started drilling cores out of ocean sediments and ice sheets to reconstruct past climate, they found that the dominant pattern is 100,000 years. The weak cycle somehow dominates the whole system. It's called the 100,000-year problem, and scientists are still trying to fully explain it. The leading idea is that there are feedback mechanisms that amplify the eccentricity cycle. Perhaps it takes a long time to build up ice sheets, but they can collapse relatively quickly. So, the system spends most of its time slowly building ice during the cool phases, then rapidly melts when conditions shift to warming. This asymmetry could explain why the 100,000-year pattern shows up so strongly. What we know is that for the past million years or so, Earth has been going through these 100,000-year climate cycles. A slow buildup of ice over tens of thousands of years, then relatively rapid melting, then another slow buildup. And during the cold phases, the world became a stage for some of the most incredible animals ever to walk the planet, the megafauna. The word mega is no exaggeration. Some of these creatures weighed 4,500 kilos or more. There are theories about why everything got so big during ice ages. One idea is Bergmann's rule, which suggests that in cold climates, mammals tend to be larger because a bigger body has a lower surface area to volume ratio. Less surface area relative to volume means less heat loss, allowing bigger bodies to stay warm more efficiently in the cold. That's why polar bears are bigger than other bear species, and why Ice Age mammals tended toward the gigantic. But size alone doesn't tell the whole story. These animals had incredible adaptations for surviving in a frozen world. The most famous, the poster child of the Ice Age, is the woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths weren't actually as huge as you might think. They were about the same size as modern elephants, maybe a bit shorter, but they were built completely differently. They had thick, shaggy fur with two layers, a dense underwool, and longer outer guard hairs. This coat could be up to a meter long in places, providing insulation so good that mammoths could handle temperatures of 40 degrees or colder. They also had small ears to minimize heat loss, unlike modern elephants with their big floppy ears used for cooling off. And they had a layer of fat up to 9 centimeters thick for extra insulation and energy storage. Their skulls were specially shaped too, with large sinus cavities that helped warm and humidify the cold, dry air before it reached their lungs. Breathing in super cold air can damage your lungs, so this was a crucial adaptation, and their teeth were perfect for grinding the tough grasses and sedges that grew on the mammoth steppe, a unique cold grassland ecosystem that covered huge areas during glacial periods. As their teeth wore down, new ones would move forward from the back of the jaw. A mammoth would go through 6 sets of teeth in its lifetime. We know so much about mammoths because some have been found frozen in permafrost, almost perfectly preserved with fur, skin, and even stomach contents intact. Scientists have studied what they ate, extracted their DNA, and found that they had special hemoglobin variants that worked better in the cold, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen more efficiently in freezing temperatures. These animals were finely tuned for Ice Age conditions. But mammoths weren't alone. The Ice Age world was packed with megafauna. Woolly rhinoceroses roamed the same landscapes, covered in thick fur with massive horns that could reach over a meter long. They used these horns to plow through snow to reach vegetation underneath. Giant ground sloths lived in the Americas, and these weren't the cute little tree sloths we know today. Some species weighed several tons and could stand up to 4 minnow tall on their hind legs. They were too big to climb trees, so they lived on the ground, feeding on vegetation and incredibly digging burrows. We found their burrows, tunnels up to 40 meters long, with claw marks on the walls that matched their fossilized claws perfectly. There were glyptodonts, basically car-sized armadillos with shells made of fused bone plates. They couldn't roll up like modern armadillos. But they didn't need to. Their shells were tough enough to stop most predators, and some species had club-like tails covered in bony spikes that they could swing as weapons. Recent studies suggest they might have been able to rear up on their hind legs, which means you could have had these armored tanks standing upright and swinging spiked clubs. That's both awesome and terrifying. And then there were the predators. Saber-toothed cats prowled the Americas with canine teeth up to 18 centimeter long, curved like daggers. They used these to deliver killing bites to the throat or belly of prey, causing massive bleeding. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern lions. Giant, short-faced bears in North America might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever, standing over 3 meters tall on their hind legs. Dire wolves hunted in packs and had more powerful jaws. I find myself constantly drawn back to the puzzle of the last ice age. For hundreds of thousands of years, this planet swung between warm and cold, ice sheets growing and melting in a predictable rhythm. But about 11,700 years ago, the music stopped. The ice melted, yes, but this time, the giants, the megafauna, didn't make it through. We're still trying to understand why the cycle that had sustained them for so long suddenly failed. Was it the speed of the warming? Was it us, humans, finally numerous and technologically advanced enough to hunt them to extinction? Or was it a combination of both? Let's drop into the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago. This was the coldest point of that 100,000-year cycle. Ice sheets were at their absolute peak, and the world was unrecognizable. Picture ice covering all of Canada, reaching down into the northern United States, up to 3 kilometers thick in places. That's like stacking the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, more than 3 times, but with solid ice covering an area the size of a continent. The weight was so immense that it pressed down on the Earth's crust, deforming the solid rock. Europe had its own massive ice sheet, the Fennoscandian, blanketing Scandinavia, the Baltic, parts of Britain, and northern Russia. Between these 2 ice sheets, you're looking at maybe 15 million cubic kilometers of ice sitting on land. If you spread that evenly over the entire land surface of Earth, it would be about 100 meters deep everywhere, an almost incomprehensible amount of water, frozen solid. With all that water locked up on land, sea levels dropped by 120 meters, as tall as a 40-story building. Coastlines extended far beyond where they are today. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by dry land. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. Indonesia, now thousands of islands, was mostly a single landmass connected to mainland Asia. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed one giant continent, and between Alaska and Siberia, where the Bering Strait is today, was a huge grassy plain called Beringia. The world map looked completely different, but it wasn't just the coastlines that changed. The climate was totally different. It wasn't just colder, it was drier, way drier. With so much water locked in ice and colder ocean temperatures reducing evaporation, there was simply less moisture in the atmosphere. Deserts expanded. Rainforests shrank to tiny pockets. What's now the Amazon basin was much drier, probably a mix of grassland and scattered trees. The Sahara was even bigger than it is today. Large parts of the world were covered in tundra or steppe, cold, dry grasslands with almost no trees. The ice sheets acted like giant refrigerators. generating cold, dense air that flowed off in powerful winds. These winds picked up dust and silt from the exposed ground and carried it hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Some parts of China have dust deposits over 100 meters thick that accumulated during glacial periods. The dust storms must have been incredible, blotting out the sun for days. This was the world at peak glaciation, harsh, cold, dry, and wind-swept. And yet, life not only survived here, it thrived. The megafauna weren't just barely scraping by, they were dominating these ecosystems, existing in numbers that probably matched or exceeded the density of large animals in Africa today. The mammoth steppe was the dominant ecosystem across huge swaths of the Northern Hemisphere. A unique mix of grasses, sedges, herbs, and low shrubs that could handle cold, dry conditions. And it supported enormous populations of large herbivores, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, all grazing together in huge herds. It must have been an incredible sight. Mammoths were the most iconic, but they weren't the only giants. Woolly rhinoceroses were just as impressive, similar in size to modern rhinos, but built for the cold. They had thick, woolly coats, 2 horns, with the front one being absolutely massive, sometimes over 1 meter long. They used these horns as snow plows to clear away snow and reach the vegetation underneath. We found woolly rhinos preserved in permafrost, too, just like mammoths, with their fur and soft tissue intact. And like mammoths, they show clear adaptations for extreme cold, including small ears and thick layers of fat. Giant ground sloths were dominating the Americas. Now, modern sloths are these cute, slow-moving animals that hang in rainforest trees, but Ice Age ground sloths were nothing like that. The largest species, Megatherium americanum, had an estimated body mass of 3,800 kilograms, heavier than most elephants. They could stand on their hind legs and reach heights of 4 meters or more. These were elephant-sized sloths, too big to climb trees, living on the ground and feeding on vegetation. And here's where it gets really interesting. We found their burrows, actual tunnels dug into hillsides, some of them 40 meters long and nearly 2 meters wide. The wild imagine encountering a multi-ton sloth emerging from an underground tunnel. It sounds made up, doesn't it? But it's real. The floors and ceilings of some burrows show claw marks that match ground sloth claws perfectly. Scientists believe these sloths dug these burrows either to escape extreme temperatures or to hide from predators. Then there were the glyptodonts, another bizarre group. Relatives of modern armadillos, but scaled up to ridiculous proportions. They weighed up to 2 tons and walked on elephant-sized legs. Their bodies were protected by shells made of hundreds of bony plates fused together like a turtle, but much larger and heavier. These shells could be over 1.5 meters long and tough enough to stop almost any predator. Some species even had tails covered in bony rings with spikes on the end. Basically, a medieval mace attached to their body. Recent biomechanical studies even suggest they could rear up on their hind legs, meaning these armored tanks could stand upright and swing their spiked tails as weapons. Absolutely wild. The diversity of megafauna during the Ice Age is staggering. In North America alone, you had mammoths, mastodons, a different family of proboscideans with different tooth structures, American horses, American camels, giant beavers the size of bears, stag moose with enormous antlers, and multiple species of giant ground sloths. In South America, there were even more ground sloth species, glyptodonts, giant armadillos, toxodons, which were kind of like hippo-sized rodent relatives, and macrauchenia, which looked like a weird cross between a camel and a small elephant with a trunk. In Eurasia, you had mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, steppe bison, giant deer called megaloceros with antlers spanning over 3.5 meters, and more. And then there were the predators, because wherever you have large herbivores, you have large carnivores hunting them. Saber-toothed cats are probably the most famous Ice Age predator. Smilodon in the Americas had those incredible canine teeth, up to 18 centimeters long and flattened like blades. These weren't for crushing bone or gripping, they were precision killing tools. Saber-tooths would use their powerful forelimbs to wrestle prey to the ground, then deliver a killing bite to the throat or belly, severing major blood vessels and causing rapid death from blood loss. The La Brea tar pits in California have preserved thousands of Ice Age animal bones, and saber-tooths are among the most common carnivores found there. This tells us they were successful predators, probably living in social groups like modern lions. And their prey wasn't small. They were taking down bison, young mammoths, horses, giant ground sloths, big, dangerous animals. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern African lions and probably hunted similar prey. Cave bears, despite the scary name, were mostly herbivorous, but they were huge, up to half a ton, and their size alone made them formidable. And then there were giant short-faced bears in North America, which might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever to exist. These bears stood over 3 meters tall on their hind legs and may have weighed up to 800 kilograms. There's debate about whether they were active predators or scavengers, but either way, you definitely didn't want to run into one. Dire wolves were another major predator, especially in the Americas. Real dire wolves, not the fantasy version. They were larger and more heavily built than modern gray wolves, with more powerful jaws designed for crushing bone. They hunted in packs and could take down prey much larger than themselves through coordinated attacks. The La Brea tar pits have yielded thousands of dire wolf fossils, more than any other carnivore, which suggests they were incredibly common. Even birds got in on the megafauna action. Teratorns were some of the largest flying birds ever, with wingspans over 3.5 meters. They probably soared on thermals like modern condors, searching for carrion. And there were even larger flightless birds in some regions. The Ice Age world had no shortage of impressive and terrifying predators. But here's what's really fascinating. All of these animals, from the smallest ground squirrels to the largest mammoths, were part of functioning ecosystems. They weren't just wandering around randomly. They had complex relationships with each other and with their environment. Herbivores competed for food and space. Predators hunted herbivores. Scavengers cleaned up the remains. Plants evolved to withstand grazing prey. It was all interconnected, and the megafauna themselves were ecosystem engineers. Mammoths, for example, didn't just eat grass. They knocked down trees, creating and maintaining open grasslands. They distributed nutrients across the landscape through their dung. They created trails and wallows. Their actions shaped the entire ecosystem. When you have animals that weigh several tons moving through an environment, they have a huge impact. Scientists have reconstructed these ancient ecosystems using multiple lines of evidence. Fossil assemblages tell us which animals live together in the same places. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth tells us what they ate and what the climate was like. Ancient DNA can be extracted from permafrost sediments, even from sediments with no visible fossils. And this tells us which species were present. Cave paintings created by humans show what animals looked like and how they behaved. By combining all this evidence, we can paint a pretty detailed picture of Ice Age life. One thing that's become clear is that these ecosystems weren't static. They changed and shifted as the climate fluctuated. Remember, even within a glacial period, there were shorter-term climate variations. Events called Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations caused rapid warming spikes lasting decades to centuries, then rapid cooling again. Standing at the last glacial maximum, looking out over a landscape of ice sheets and cold grasslands, seeing mammoths and rhinos and giant sloths moving through it, I think you'd be witnessing something that will probably never exist again. These ecosystems are gone now. The megapora are extinct. The mammoth steppe has vanished, replaced by forests and tundra. It's a lost world. I find it fascinating that these temperature swings affected where animals could live, what vegetation grew, and which species thrived versus struggled. The Ice Age world was dynamic, constantly responding to climate changes on multiple timescales. Humans were part of this world, too. Our ancestors lived alongside these megafauna. They hunted some of them, competed with predators for resources, and adapted their own technology and culture to survive in glacial conditions. In Europe, Neanderthals had been living through these cycles for hundreds of thousands of years. They were cold-adapted with stocky builds, large nasal cavities to warm air, and sophisticated tools. They hunted megafauna, made complex weapons, used fire effectively, and even had symbolic culture with art and burial rituals. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago. They brought new technologies, more complex social structures, and wider trade networks. They overlapped with Neanderthals for thousands of years, sharing the landscape and the megafauna. In fact, we now know from genetic evidence that they interbred. Most people of European or Asian descent carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. In other parts of the world, modern humans were also adapting to Ice Age conditions and living alongside megafauna in Asia, in Australia, which humans reached at least 65,000 years ago, and eventually in the Americas. The interaction between humans and megafauna is one of the most debated topics in Ice Age research. But for now, just appreciate the sheer diversity and strangeness of life during peak glaciation. That world was the creation of the 100,000-year cycle. The cold phase of the cycle created the conditions, and life adapted to fill every available niche. For hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern repeated. Cold phase, megafauna thrive. Warm phase, forests expand. Cold phase again, megafauna come back. It was a rhythm that life on Earth had adapted to. And then about 19,000 years ago, something started to shift. The orbital cycles were moving into a configuration that favored warming. Northern Hemisphere summers were getting stronger. The ice sheets began to melt. And what happened next would change everything. The transition from the last glacial period to our current interglacial was one of the most dramatic climate changes in recent Earth history. And caught in the middle of that transition were all of these megafauna that had evolved to thrive in a frozen world. Most of them wouldn't make it through. So, we've talked about what these Ice Age giants looked like. But let's get into the details of how they actually lived, because the more we learn about these animals, the more incredible they become. Some of the discoveries are genuinely surprising. Let's start with something that sounds impossible. Giant ground sloths digging massive burrows. When scientists first found these tunnels in South America, particularly in Argentina near Mar del Plata, they weren't what made them. The burrows were huge, some reaching 5 to 6 meters below the surface, up to 1.8 meters wide and 40 meters long. That's a 2-story house worth of tunnel underground. Multiple mammal species were considered as possible diggers, but the evidence kept pointing to ground sloths, specifically species like Glossotherium and Celidotherium. The first clue was their arm bones. Ground sloth forelimbs were designed in a shovel-like structure with unusually long second and third fingers, perfect for digging. And the bones were super strong, designed to withstand the kind of bending forces you'd get from digging through hard soil, similar to the stresses that galloping mammals put on their leg bones. The second clue was their center of gravity. Paleontologists estimated from the skeleton that ground sloths had their center of gravity above their hind feet, which means they could rear up into a bipedal posture. This is crucial for digging because your arms need to be free to excavate, not supporting your body weight. You can't dig effectively if you're on all fours. And the final smoking gun was claw marks on the walls and ceilings of the burrows, perfectly preserved in the fossilized tunnels. Scientists matched these marks to ground sloth hand skeletons, and they fit exactly. These sloths weren't just big. They were engineering huge underground structures for animals weighing 800 to 1,200 kilos. This is incredible behavior. Why were they doing it? The leading theories are either temperature regulation or predator avoidance. Underground temperatures are much more stable than on the surface. If you're trying to escape extreme heat or cold, a burrow makes sense. Or maybe they were hiding from predators like saber-toothed cats or giant short-faced bears. When you're big but not fast, going underground where predators can't easily follow you is a smart strategy. Either way, it shows these animals were way more behaviorally complex than we might expect from something called a giant sloth. Here's another fascinating discovery about ground sloths. In Ecuador, at a site called Tank Loma, paleontologists found the remains of at least 22 Eremotherium sloths of various ages, all in the same location. They likely died during a drought, getting trapped in a shrinking watering hole. But the cool part is what this tells us about their behavior. They were congregating at watering holes, which means they were social animals living in groups. And they were probably wallowing in the water to escape heat and insects, similar to how hippos and rhinos behave today. The last mammoths lived on Wrangler Island in the Arctic Ocean. What's incredible to me is that this island was cut off from the mainland when sea levels rose after the ice sheets melted. A population of around 500 to 1,000 mammoths survived there in isolation, till about 4,000 years ago. That's after the pyramids of Giza were built. Mammoths and ancient civilizations overlapped in time. It's a strange thought that the last of these giants was still walking around on a remote Arctic island while humans in Egypt were building monuments and developing writing. And then they went extinct, likely due to a combination of inbreeding, habitat degradation on their small island, and possibly climate change or human arrival. It was the end of an evolutionary line that had lasted for millions of years. I've also been studying woolly rhinoceros. Like mammoths, they had thick, woolly coats and were built for the cold. But their behavior was probably different based on their tooth wear and the isotopes in their bones. Scientists think woolly rhinos were more selective feeders than mammoths. While mammoths were bulk grazers, eating lots of whatever vegetation was available, woolly rhinos seemed to be pickier, probably using their horns to dig through snow to find specific plants they preferred. Then there's the giant deer, Megaloceros. Their antlers were absolutely insane. The largest specimens had antlers spanning over 3 1/2 meters from tip to tip. That's wider than a car. These antlers could weigh up to 40 kilograms. Carrying that much weight on your head takes serious neck and shoulder muscles. Scientists think these massive antlers were primarily for display and competition between males, similar to how modern deer use their antlers. During mating season, males would show off their antlers to females and use them in battles with rival males. The bigger your antlers, the more impressive you looked. But those antlers came with a cost. Growing them required huge amounts of calcium and energy, and carrying them around was energetically expensive. Only the healthiest, best-fed males could support truly enormous antlers. Cave bears are interesting because, despite their name and their size, they were mostly herbivorous. Isotope analysis of their bones shows they ate primarily plants. They were built like grizzly bears but acted more like giant pandas. They hibernated in caves during winter, which is where we find most of their fossils. Some caves in Europe have thousands of cave bear bones, representing hundreds or thousands of individuals that hibernated there over millennia. And cave bears went extinct earlier than many other megafauna, around 27,000 to 24,000 years ago, well before the end of the last glacial period. The reasons aren't entirely clear, but it might have been related to competition with humans for cave space, climate changes affecting their food supply, or a combination of factors. Gyptoodons are still blowing my mind the more I learn about them. Recent studies of their skeletal structure and muscle attachment points suggest they were capable of some surprising behaviors. They might have been able to rear up, as we mentioned, but they also show adaptations for powerful digging, similar to what we see in modern armadillos, but scaled up massively. So, these armored giants might have dug burrows like their ground sloth contemporaries. Imagine tunnels big enough for a Volkswagen Beetle to drive through, created by armored animals with spiky tails. The Ice Age was wild. The predators of the Ice Age were just as specialized as the herbivores. Saber-toothed cats didn't just have those impressive fangs for show. Biomechanical studies of their skulls show they had relatively weak bite forces compared to modern big cats, but their neck muscles were incredibly powerful. The hunting strategy was probably to use their strong forelimbs to wrestle prey down. then use their neck muscles to drive those saber teeth deep into the prey's throat or belly with precision. It wasn't about crushing force. It was about precision. Dire wolves fascinate me, especially when I consider the sheer number of their fossils found in the La Brea tar pits. Thousands of them trapped over tens of thousands of years. It paints a vivid, if grim, picture. What I find most compelling, though, isn't just their demise, but what their bones tell us about their lives. The fossil record shows that many dire wolves had broken teeth, healed fractures, and signs of arthritis, particularly in older individuals. It suggests a complex social structure, one where injured or elderly members were cared for. A wolf with a broken leg or missing teeth simply couldn't hunt on its own. If the pack shared food, however, it could survive. The evidence really does point toward social behaviors remarkably similar to modern wolves. Giant short-faced bears, on the other hand, remain more enigmatic. Were they primarily predators or scavengers? The evidence is still mixed. Their long legs suggest they could cover vast distances efficiently, a trait useful for scavenging. But their powerful jaws and teeth were certainly capable of killing prey. Perhaps they were opportunistic, hunting when they could and scavenging when necessary. Their sheer size, potentially making them the largest mammalian land predator ever, suggests they could easily intimidate smaller predators and steal their kills. I can almost picture a pack of dire wolves bringing down a bison, only to have a giant short-faced bear appear and chase them off, claiming the carcass for itself. One of the coolest things about studying these Ice Age ecosystems is the unusual sources of evidence we have. Ancient DNA preserved in sediments, for instance. Even without bones or visible fossils, animal DNA can be preserved in frozen soil. Scientists have developed techniques to extract and identify this environmental DNA, revealing which species were present in different places at different times. This has filled in gaps in the fossil record, showing us that Ice Age ecosystems were even more diverse than we initially realized. For example, we now know that horses existed in areas where we haven't found horse fossils, simply because we found horse DNA in the soil. We've identified plants that grew in certain regions by finding their pollen and DNA. We can even infer the climate by examining the species of plants and insects present. It's like reading an ancient ecological record written in genetic code. Humans, of course, were observing and interacting with all of this megafauna, and they left their own records of what they saw. Cave art, from sites like Lascaux in France and Chauvet Cave, show remarkably accurate depictions of Ice Age animals. The artists painted mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, horses, cave lions, and more. These paintings aren't crude stick figures. They're sophisticated artworks, showing animals in motion, using the natural contours of the cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. The artists clearly spent a lot of time observing these animals to capture them so accurately. Some cave paintings even show details like fur patterns, seasonal coat changes, and behavioral poses. There's a famous painting of a woolly rhino that clearly shows its thick fur and the way it held its head. There are paintings of mammoths that show their characteristic domed heads and long tusks. These artworks are a direct visual record of what Ice Age megafauna looked like, created by people who saw them alive. Humans also left behind butchered animal bones showing clear-cut marks from stone tools, mammoth bones with spear points embedded in them, campsites with hearths surrounded by the remains of horses, bison, and reindeer. The archaeological record proves that humans hunted megafauna and relied on them for food, materials for tools and clothing, and fat for fuel. Mammoth ivory was carved into art objects and tools. Hides were used for clothing and shelter. Bones were used to build dwelling structures in areas with scarce wood. Every part of these animals was utilized. But humans weren't just passive observers or simple hunters. There's evidence suggesting that humans might have used fire to manage landscapes, creating and maintaining the open grasslands that megafauna depended on. By burning vegetation regularly, humans could prevent forests from encroaching on grasslands, keeping habitats open for the large herbivores they hunted. This kind of ecosystem engineering might have actually helped support megafauna populations in some regions. The relationship between humans and megafauna was complex, not just predator and prey. The 100,000-year cycle had created this entire world. The cold phase of the cycle produced these unique ecosystems and drove the evolution of specialized megafauna adapted to frozen conditions. For hundreds of thousands of years, the pattern repeated. Ice sheets advanced. Megafauna thrived. Ice sheets retreated. Forests expanded. Ice sheets advanced again. Life adapted to this rhythm. But then, about 19,000 years ago, the cycle began shifting toward warming again, and this time, something was different. This time, humans had spread across most of the world, developed sophisticated hunting technologies, and existed in larger numbers than ever before. This time, when the climate started changing and the ice began to melt, the megafauna wouldn't just adapt and wait for the cycle to swing back to cold like they had for hundreds of thousands of years. This time, most of them were going to disappear forever. And we're still debating exactly why. So, around 19,000 years ago, the 100,000-year cycle reached a turning point. The orbital configuration shifted into a pattern that favored warming. Northern Hemisphere summers started getting stronger, receiving more solar radiation. And when that happens, winter snow starts melting more completely each summer. Ice sheets stop growing and begin their long retreat. The transition from glacial to interglacial conditions was underway. But deglaciation isn't a smooth process. It's a series of fits and starts. Sudden collapses, temporary reversals, and periods of rapid change would have been noticeable within a single human lifetime. And this messiness is what makes understanding the megafauna extinction so complicated. The first major pulse of melting began around 19,000 years ago and continued for several millennia. As ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, pouring water back into the oceans. During meltwater pulse 1A, roughly 400 to 600 years ago, sea levels rose by about 20 meters in less than 500 years. 20 meters might not sound huge, but that's enough to flood vast coastal areas, submerge land bridges, and completely transform coastlines. All that water had to come from somewhere, and it came from collapsing sections of the great ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet, that massive dome of ice covering Canada, began breaking apart. The Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe did the same. As they melted, They left behind a landscape that had been compressed under kilometers of ice for thousands of years. The land was scraped clean, covered in glacial till, and dotted with lakes formed in depressions carved by ice. It must have been a raw, bare landscape at first, slowly being colonized by plants as the climate warmed. But the warming wasn't steady. There were dramatic interruptions. The most famous is the Younger Dryas event. By around 14 to 700 years ago, the world had been warming for thousands of years. Ice sheets were in retreat. Things seemed to be heading towards interglacial conditions. Then suddenly, temperatures crashed. In Greenland, temperatures dropped by about 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades, possibly faster. Some evidence suggests it could have happened in as little as 10 to 20 years. The North Atlantic region was plunged back into near-glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. The leading theory involves a catastrophic flood. As the Laurentide ice sheet melted, water pooled up behind it, forming enormous glacial lakes. The largest was Glacial Lake Agassiz, which was bigger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. This lake was dammed in by the ice sheet itself, and when that ice dam failed, geological evidence suggests it did multiple times. Absolutely stupendous amounts of fresh water flooded into the ocean in a geologically instant time frame. We're talking about enough water to raise global sea levels by several meters, all released in months to years. This massive freshwater dump disrupted ocean circulation in the North Atlantic. There's this ocean circulation pattern called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. It's basically a conveyor belt where warm surface water flows north, cools down near Greenland, becomes dense and sinks, then flows south at depth. This circulation transports enormous amounts of heat from the tropics to the Northern Hemisphere. But fresh water is less dense than salt water. When you dump a huge amount of fresh water into the North Atlantic, it floats on top and prevents the normal sinking of cold, dense water. This can slow down or shut down the AMOC. And when the AMOC stops, the Northern Hemisphere stops receiving that massive heat transport from the tropics. Temperatures crash, and you're back to near-glacial conditions. The Younger Dryas had effects far beyond the North Atlantic. Climate patterns shifted across the globe. Some regions got drier, others wetter. Temperatures changed, and this had huge impacts on ecosystems and the animals living in them. For megafauna that were already stressed by changing habitats as the climate warmed and forests expanded, the Younger Dryas cold snap might have provided a temporary reprieve, but it also added instability to an already unstable situation, and it had major impacts on human societies too. In the Middle East, this is right around the time agriculture first developed. Some scientists think the climate stress of the Younger Dryas might have pushed hunter-gatherer groups to start deliberately cultivating plants as a way to end food security when wild resources became unreliable. If that's true, then this climate event, triggered by the 100,000-year cycle transitioning from glacial to interglacial, literally changed the course of human history, setting us on the path to farming, settled civilizations, and everything that followed. But eventually, around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended, and it ended just as abruptly as it started. Temperatures spiked upward again. In some regions, temperatures rose by 10 degrees Celsius or more in just a decade or two. That's mind-bogglingly fast for natural climate change. The Amos kicked back into gear. Heat flooded northward again. Ice sheets resumed their collapse. And this time, there was no going back. The transition to full interglacial conditions was complete. We call this the beginning of the Holocene, our current geological epoch, and it marks the end of the last glacial period. For the megafauna, this was catastrophic. They had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to thrive in cold, open grassland environments. But as the Holocene began, those environments were disappearing. The mammoth steppe, that unique ecosystem of cold grasslands that had supported enormous populations of large herbivores, was transforming. Forests were expanding, grasslands were shrinking. The climate was getting wetter and warmer. For animals adapted to cold and dry conditions, this was a crisis, and the extinctions came fast. In North America, most megafauna disappeared between about 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant short-faced bears, all gone within a few thousand years. That's 70 to 80% of large mammal species just vanished. I find myself constantly drawn back to the Quaternary extinction event. It was utterly devastating. Europe, too, suffered immense losses, though the timing shifted depending on the species. Woolly mammoths vanished from most places, clinging to existence only in isolated spots like Wrangel Island. Woolly rhinos disappeared entirely. Cave lions, too, were gone. And the giant deer? They died out. The megafauna that had once dominated Europe during the Ice Age were either gone or drastically reduced. South America wasn't spared either. Its megafauna disappeared. Giant ground sloths, all the unique species that had evolved there, extinct. Glyptodonts, gone. Native horses and camels, extinct. Toxodonts, macrauchenia, and giant armadillos, all vanished. The wave of extinction swept through the Americas with the speed and ferocity of a wildfire. Australia had already lost most of its megafauna earlier, between roughly 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. Giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, massive flightless birds, even a marsupial lion, all disappeared. The timing in Australia is particularly intriguing, as it seems to coincide more closely with the arrival of humans than with the last deglaciation. This adds another layer to the puzzle of what caused these extinctions. What killed them? That's the question that has been debated for decades, and honestly, it's still not completely settled. There are two main schools of thought: the climate change hypothesis and the human hunting hypothesis. The truth, I suspect, is probably a combination of both, with the relative importance of each varying by region and species. The climate change hypothesis suggests that the rapid warming and transformation of ecosystems was simply too much for these animals to handle. Megafauna had evolved for cold, open habitats. When those habitats disappeared in just a few thousand years, they couldn't adapt quickly enough. As forests expanded and grasslands shrank, megafauna populations became fragmented into smaller and smaller pockets of suitable habitat. Small, isolated populations are especially vulnerable to inbreeding, disease, and random environmental fluctuations. This can create an extinction vortex, where declining populations face multiple compounding threats, making recovery impossible. there's compelling evidence supporting climate change as a major factor. The extinctions occurred during a period of incredibly rapid climate change. Species adapted to cold climates, like woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos, went extinct, while species adapted to forests or warmer climates generally survived. This pattern strongly suggests that climate played a significant role. However, megafauna had survived previous deglaciations. The 100,000-year cycle means that there were multiple transitions from glacial to interglacial conditions over the past few million years. If megafauna survived those, why not this one? That's where the human hunting hypothesis comes in. Modern humans had spread across most of the world by the end of the last ice age, and humans are incredibly effective hunters, especially with the technological innovations that developed during this period. Atlatls, which are spear throwers that dramatically extend your range and power. Sophisticated hunting strategies involving coordinated groups, and later bows and arrows. Human populations were growing and spreading into new territories. Critically, many megafauna had little or no evolutionary experience with human hunters when humans first arrived in the Americas or Australia. The local megafauna hadn't evolved fear responses to these two-legged predators. They were naive prey. Modern examples illustrate this pattern. When humans first reached oceanic islands with no previous human presence, the native birds and mammals often showed no fear and were easily hunted to extinction within decades or centuries. The same might have happened with Ice Age megafauna. They simply didn't recognize humans as threats until it was too late. Here's a crucial point about hunting megafauna. You don't need to hunt intensively to drive them extinct. These animals have slow reproductive rates. A female mammoth might have a calf only every 5 years, and mammoths don't reach sexual maturity until their teens. If you kill even a few individuals per year from a population, especially females of reproductive age, you can drive the population into decline. Mathematical models show that even very low-intensity hunting, killing just a few % of the population per year, can drive large-bodied animals extinct over centuries or millennia. And we know humans hunted megafauna. We found butchered mammoth bones at human sites, spear points embedded in mammoth ribs, kill sites where multiple animals were driven off cliffs or into traps and then butchered, even cave paintings showing hunting scenes. The evidence is undeniable. The question, though, is whether hunting alone could cause extinctions, or whether it was just the final straw for populations already struggling with climate change. The timing is certainly suspicious in many regions. In North America, the extinctions coincide almost exactly with the expansion of Clovis culture, a group of humans with particularly effective hunting technology. Clovis points, these distinctive spear points, are found at sites with butchered mammoth remains. Within a few thousand years of Clovis people spreading across North America, the megafauna were gone. That's awfully coincidental timing. A study of the Anzic child, the only known Clovis individual, provides some interesting evidence. This was an 18-month-old child buried about 12,700 years ago in Montana. Scientists analyzed isotopes from the bones to reconstruct the diet of the child's mother. They found that mammoth contributed around 40% of the maternal protein diet, similar to the diet of specialized mammoth predators like scimitar cats. This suggests Clovis people were heavily targeting mammoths, possibly as specialized mammoth hunters. But we need to be careful not to overinterpret. The Anzac child is one individual. We can't say all Clovis people had the same diet or hunting focus. The disappearance of the Ice Age giants, it still haunts me to think that mammoths roamed the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, enduring cycle after cycle of cold and warmth. It was a rhythm they understood, a dance they'd mastered. But then, something shifted. It wasn't just the familiar warming trend. This time, humans arrived, armed with sophisticated tools and an insatiable need for resources. The combination proved fatal. Climate change weakened them, fragmented their habitats, and then we delivered the final blow, and the effects likely rippled outwards. Humans, I read, used fire to reshape the land, altering vegetation. The loss of mammoths themselves transformed ecosystems. These giants were ecosystem engineers, maintaining open grasslands. When they vanished, forests took over, further diminishing the habitat for any remaining megafauna. It was a cascade, each element intertwined. There's still debate, of course, about just how many people existed back then. Could relatively small populations have truly hunted mammoths to extinction across an entire continent? Some scientists remain skeptical. The extinction patterns themselves are puzzling. Some species disappeared early, while others lingered. The mammoths on Wrangel Island, for example, survived until around 4,000 years ago, millennia after their mainland cousins vanished. Cave bears went extinct before many others. Dire wolves disappeared, yet gray wolves persisted. Bison, despite being heavily hunted, somehow survived. The reasons why some species made it while others didn't are still being unraveled. The deadly combination of climate change and human press is undeniable, though. Climate change weakened the megafauna by fragmenting habitats and reducing food. Human hunting then prevented already struggling populations from bouncing back. Together, these factors created a perfect storm. But the story of the Ice Age isn't just about the megafauna. It's also about the humans who lived through those 100,000-year cycles. And when I say humans, I'm not just talking about us, Homo sapiens. We weren't alone. Neanderthals were already well established when our ancestors arrived, and I think they deserve far more recognition than they typically receive. They were the original Ice Age survivors. They evolved in Europe and parts of Asia hundreds of thousands of years ago, enduring glacial cycles long before modern humans even left Africa. They weren't some brutish dead end. They were intelligent humans, remarkably well adapted to glacial conditions. Their adaptations were, in a word, brilliant. Take their physical structure. Neanderthals were short and stocky, with barreled chests and thick, heavy bones. A male might stand only about 160 centimeters tall, but they were built like tanks, powerfully muscular, their bones revealing massive muscle attachments. This wasn't random chance. It was an adaptation to the cold. Shorter, stockier bodies have less surface area relative to their volume, minimizing heat loss. It's Bergman's rule in action, the same principle that drove Ice Age megafauna to such immense sizes. In frigid climates, compact bodies retain heat more effectively. Their faces were also distinctive, with large noses and wide nasal passages. These weren't aesthetic features. Those large nasal cavities acted as built-in air conditioners, warming and humidifying the frigid, dry air before it reached the lungs. Repeatedly breathing supercold air can damage lung tissue, so this was crucial. It's the same adaptation we see in woolly mammoths with their enlarged sinuses. Different species, same solution to the same problem, convergent evolution at work. But physical adaptations are just part of the story. Neanderthals possessed sophisticated culture and technology. They crafted complex stone tools using the levallois technique, carefully preparing a core and then striking off flakes of predetermined shapes. This requires planning and mental visualization. You have to envision the finished tool in your mind before you even begin working the stone. They also created wooden spears, carefully shaped and balanced, with tips hardened by fire. Some of these spears, preserved in German peat bogs, are testaments to their craftsmanship. Neanderthals hunted big, dangerous game. Sites reveal bones of bison, reindeer, wild horses, even woolly rhinoceros and mammoth. These weren't scavenged carcasses. The bones bear clear butchery marks, made with stone tools while the meat was fresh. Neanderthals actively hunted animals that could easily kill them if the hunt went wrong. That requires coordination, communication, planning, and courage. They used fire extensively and effectively, not just for warmth and cooking, but for creating complex adhesives. Archaeologists have unearthed Neanderthal tools with birch bark tar, used to attach stone points to wooden handles. Making birch bark tar involves heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen at specific temperatures. It's a multi-step process that demands technical knowledge and precise control. You can't just stumble upon this. They understood the process and could replicate it reliably. Even more impressively, Neanderthals possessed symbolic culture. They created ornamental objects, pierced shells and eagle talons, apparently worn as jewelry. They used pigments, possibly for body painting, decorating objects, or even cave walls. And they buried their dead, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods or in deliberate postures. The burial at Shanidar Cave in Iraq is particularly famous. Evidence suggests that flowers may have been placed in the grave, though that remains a topic of debate. The question that haunts me most is this: if Neanderthals were so capable, so well adapted, why did they disappear? The last of them died out around 40,000 years ago, just as modern humans spread into Europe. The timing is suspicious, isn't it? Did we outcompete them, absorb them through interbreeding, or did we kill them off directly? The intentional burial of their dead isn't controversial anymore. Neanderthals clearly thought about death, and they had rituals. That's deeply human. They even created art. In Spanish caves, I've seen the abstract geometric patterns and hand stencils dating back to when Neanderthals were the only ones there. It pushes back the timeline of symbolic behavior, and it wasn't just one isolated group. Similar markings have been found at multiple sites, which suggests it was part of a broader Neanderthal culture. The genetic evidence is clear. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. If you're of European or Asian descent, you probably carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. It might not sound like much, but it proves our ancestors and Neanderthals were having children together, and those children survived and had their own children. Some Neanderthal genes are still with us today, including variants that affect immune function, skin and hair traits, and even susceptibility to certain diseases. So, at some level, Neanderthals didn't completely go extinct. They were absorbed into the modern human gene pool. But as a distinct population, with their own culture and identity, Neanderthals didn't survive. One major factor was probably demographics. Modern human populations seem to have been larger and more widespread. When two populations are competing for the same resources, the one with more individuals usually wins through sheer numbers. Even if individual Neanderthals were just as capable as individual modern humans, if they were outnumbered 10 to 1, they'd eventually be swamped by the larger population. Modern humans also seem to have had some technological advantages. While Neanderthals made excellent tools, modern humans developed more diverse and specialized tool kits. They made fine bone needles for sewing fitted clothing, which provides better insulation than just wrapping hides around yourself. They made fishing equipment like hooks and harpoons, expanding their food sources. They created more prolific art and ornaments, possibly indicating more complex social structures or better communication systems. And modern humans had wider trade networks. I've seen materials at modern human sites that came from hundreds of kilometers away, showing they were exchanging goods over large distances. Neanderthal trade networks were more localized. Trade isn't just about stuff. It's about information exchange and social connections. Wider networks mean more people sharing ideas and innovations, which accelerates cultural evolution and adaptation. Some researchers think modern humans might have had slightly better language abilities, allowing more complex planning and coordination, or maybe they had different social structures that were more effective at resource acquisition or raising children. These are subtle differences that wouldn't show up obviously in archaeological remains, but over generations they could compound into significant advantages. Climate might have played a role, too. The late Ice Age was incredibly unstable climatically, with rapid swings between cold and warm. Maybe Neanderthals, who were specialized for cold, stable conditions, struggled more with rapid climate fluctuations. Modern humans coming from Africa, which had its own climate variability, might have been more adaptable to changing conditions. But this is speculative. We don't really know. What's clear is that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone, and modern humans were the only human species left in Europe. And modern humans were spreading everywhere, adapting to every environment Earth had to offer. By the end of the last glacial period, humans had reached every continent except Antarctica, and they'd done it while surviving the 100,000-year cycle at its most extreme phase. Modern humans developed an impressive array of technologies during the late Ice Age. Projectile weapons were a game changer. Early humans used thrusting spears that required getting close to prey, dangerous when you're hunting mammoth. Then they invented the atlatl, a spear thrower that acts as a lever arm to dramatically increase throwing range and power. Suddenly, you could attack from tens of meters away, much safer. Later, probably between 20 and 30,000 years ago, in some regions, humans invented the bow and arrow. This was huge. Arrows are faster and more accurate than atlatl darts. You can carry more ammunition. You can hunt smaller, faster animals more effectively. The bow might be one of the most important technological innovations in human history. It fundamentally changed how humans could acquire food and defend themselves. Hunting strategies became more sophisticated, too. There's evidence of drive hunting where groups would herd animals toward cliffs or into constructed traps. Sites with hundreds of bison or horses that were driven off cliffs and butchered. This requires serious coordination among large groups of people. You need scouts, drivers, people positioned at the cliff to finish off injured animals, butchers, all working together with precise timing. It's complex social behavior that requires communication and planning. Fishing also became important. Humans developed harpoons, fish hooks made from bone, and nets. We opened up aquatic resources as a source of sustenance. I often think about how the Ice Age, in a very real sense, forged modern human behavior. The technological innovations, the social structures, the symbolic thinking, all developed or were refined during the harsh conditions of those glacial cycles. Our success as a species was built on adaptations to a frozen world. One crucial adaptation was focusing on food sources that were more reliable than hunting megafauna. Fishing, in particular, became a major staple, especially in coastal and riverine areas. And compared to hunting mammoth, it was relatively low risk. Coastal sites revealed just how intensively fish and shellfish were exploited, with enormous shell middens representing the remains of thousands upon thousands of meals. Clothing technology also improved dramatically. Around 40,000 years ago, bone needles appear in the archaeological record. These weren't just for any kind of sewing. They were for creating fitted clothing with sleeves and clothes. If you've ever tried staying warm simply by wrapping animal hides around yourself, you know it's not very effective. Fitted clothing is far better at trapping body heat. This seemingly simple technology likely allowed humans to survive in even colder regions and remain active during winter rather than just hunkering down. Shelter evolved, too. In regions with scarce wood, people built structures using mammoth bones and tusks as a framework, covering them with hides. These mammoth bone houses have been found in places like Ukraine and Russia. Some use bones from dozens of individual mammoths, representing thousands of kilograms of material. These were substantial dwellings, not temporary camps. People were investing serious effort into creating comfortable, long-term living spaces. And let's not forget art. Ice Age humans created stunning artwork. Cave paintings like those at Lascaux and Chauvet in France are justly famous. These aren't crude drawings. They're sophisticated, dynamic images of animals rendered with incredible skill and accuracy. The artists used the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. They mixed pigments to achieve different colors and understood techniques like shading and perspective. Some paintings even show animals in motion, running or fighting, capturing movement in a static image. But it wasn't just cave paintings. People carved figurines from ivory, bone, and stone. The Venus figurines, stylized female forms found across Europe, date to this period. Some have elaborate details like hairstyles or clothing carved into them. People also made musical instruments, like flutes carved from bird bones or mammoth ivory. They created elaborate burials with grave goods including thousands of ivory beads sewn onto clothing. One burial of children at Sungir in Russia included so many beads that researchers estimated it would have taken thousands of hours to make them. These people valued symbolic expression enough to invest enormous time and effort into it. Why did humans create art? Probably for many reasons. Some cave art might have been connected to hunting magic or spiritual rituals. Some figurines might have been religious or fertility symbols. Some art was probably just for aesthetic plea or social bonding. The point is, Ice Age humans weren't just focused on survival. They had rich inner lives, symbolic thinking, spiritual beliefs, and cultural traditions. They were fully modern, mentally and behaviorally, even though they lived in conditions we'd find incredibly harsh. Human populations during the Ice Age weren't huge by modern standards. Estimates suggest maybe just a few million people worldwide, but those people had spread across most habitable regions. They'd reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, crossing significant water gaps even during low sea levels. They'd spread throughout Asia and Europe, and critically, they'd made it to the Americas. The peopling of the Americas is a fascinating story in itself. During peak glaciation, when sea levels were low, the Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America. But this wasn't just a narrow strip. Beringia was a vast region, probably thousands of kilometers wide, with its own ecosystems. Humans crossed it, likely following game animals, entering a continent with no previous human population and megafauna that had never encountered human hunters. The timing is still debated. The oldest widely accepted sites in the Americas date to about 15 to 16,000 years ago, but there are controversial sites that might be older, suggesting people could have arrived as early as 20 to 30,000 years ago. Either way, once humans were in the Americas, they spread incredibly fast. Within just a few thousand years, there's evidence of human presence from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. That's an incredible migration speed. And remember, the American megafauna went extinct shortly after humans arrived. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels, all gone within a few thousand years of human appearance. The timing strongly suggests humans played a major role. The Clovis people, with their distinctive spear points and apparent focus on hunting mammoths, have been particularly implicated. But it's complicated. Climate was changing rapidly at the same time. It's probably both factors working together. By the time the Holocene began 11,700 years ago, humans were the dominant large animal on multiple continents. We'd outlasted Neanderthals and other human species. We'd survived the wild climate swings of deglaciation. We'd adapted to every environment from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra. And we developed incredibly diverse cultures and technologies. Despite being one species genetically, humans showed cultural diversity that no other species has ever matched. This set the stage for what came next, the development of agriculture and the rise of civilization. But that's a different chapter in the story, and now that world is gone, melted away as the cycle shifted to its warm phase. The question is, it's a question I often ask myself, are we truly adapted to the world we inhabit now? Or are we simply carrying evolutionary baggage from an ice age that ended millennia ago? The shift has been dramatic. The ice melted, the megafauna largely disappeared, and humans now live in a world utterly different from that experienced by our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. We entered the Holocene, our current interglacial period, and everything changed. Around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas cold snap finally released its grip. Temperatures rose rapidly, stabilizing into conditions remarkably similar to those we experience today. The climate grew warmer and wetter than it had been during the glacial period. Forests expanded, carpeting areas that had once been cold grasslands and tundra. Sea levels continued to rise as the last major ice sheets melted, reshaping coastlines and creating the geography we recognize. A transformation, truly dramatic and relatively swift. For humans who had lived as hunter-gatherers, this new world presented both opportunities and challenges. Warmer temperatures meant longer growing seasons, a more diverse range of vegetation, and a more predictable climate. Yet, the megafauna they had hunted, those massive herds of mammoth, bison, and horses that had been reliable food sources, were disappearing, teetering on the brink of extinction. Humans had to adapt their subsistence strategies, and they had to do it fast. In some regions, people turned heavily to fishing and gathering shellfish. Coastal sites from this period reveal enormous shell middens and fishbone deposits. The ocean, now stable and productive, provided a reliable source of sustenance. In other regions, the focus shifted to smaller game, deer, rabbits, and birds, supplemented with gathered nuts, seeds, roots, and berries. But these smaller animals required different hunting techniques than the megafauna. You can't drive deer off cliffs effectively. You need different tools, different strategies. And then, in a few special regions, something revolutionary happened. People began deliberately planting and cultivating wild plants. The beginning of agriculture. It changed everything about human society. The first clear evidence of agriculture appears in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East around 11 to 10,000 years ago. People began cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep and goats. In China, rice and millet cultivation began around 9,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica, maize was domesticated around the same time. In multiple regions independently, within just a few thousand years of each other, humans invented farming. The question of why agriculture developed when it did has been debated endlessly. One theory points to population pres. During the Ice Age, human populations were kept relatively small by harsh conditions and limited food resources. But as the Holocene began and conditions improved, populations may have grown to the point where hunting and gathering simply couldn't support everyone. Agriculture, producing more calories per unit of land than hunting and gathering, could support higher population densities. If your population outgrows your hunting territory, you either starve, migrate, or innovate, and some groups chose innovation. Another theory emphasizes climate stability. Agriculture requires planning for the future. You plant seeds and wait months for the harvest. This only makes sense if you can reasonably predict that conditions will remain suitable for plant growth. During the wildly fluctuating climate of the late Ice Age, with events like the Younger Dryas, that wasn't a safe bet. But during the Holocene, the climate became more stable and predictable. You could plant in spring and be reasonably confident that summer would come and your crops would mature. This stability made agriculture viable in a way it hadn't been before. There's also the theory that the Younger Dryas specifically triggered agriculture in the Middle East. The idea is that hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent had developed semi-sedentary lifestyles during the warm period before the Younger Dryas, living in villages and intensively harvesting wild grains. Then the Younger Dryas hit, and those wild grains became less productive. To maintain their lifestyles and avoid starvation, people started actively cultivating the grains, selecting for varieties that produced more food. When the Younger Dryas ended, they were already farming and simply continued. Whatever the initial trigger, agriculture spread rapidly once it started, bringing with it a massive package of changes to human society. You can't be nomadic and farm effectively. You need to stay in one place to tend crops and protect them from animals and thieves. So, agriculture led to permanent settlements, villages that grew into towns and eventually cities. These settlements required new forms of social organization. Who controls the land? How do you store surplus food? How do you defend your settlement? How do you resolve disputes? Agriculture also changed human diets dramatically, and not always for the better. Hunter-gatherers typically had diverse diets with lots of protein and varied nutrients from many plant and animal sources. Early farmers ate mostly carbohydrates from a few grain crops, supplemented with whatever else they could grow or gather. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show signs of nutritional stress compared to hunter-gatherers. More cavities from all the starchy foods, shorter average stature, diseases associated with dietary deficiencies. Agriculture allowed population growth, but individual health often declined. Disease became a much bigger problem once humans started living in permanent settlements. When you're nomadic and moving frequently, your waste gets left behind, and diseases don't have time to build up. But in permanent villages, the rise of agriculture wasn't just a step forward, it was a double-edged sword. It could sustain far more people per square kilometer than hunting and gathering ever could. But this agricultural revolution also brought us closer to a new kind of peril: infectious diseases. Living in dense populations, accumulating waste, and living in close proximity to domesticated animals created the perfect storm for outbreaks. Many of the diseases that plague us today, measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, originated in animals and made the jump to humans once we began sharing living spaces with livestock. Farming, in a way, made us more vulnerable. Despite these risks, agriculture's overwhelming advantage was its capacity to support larger populations. More people meant more workers, more soldiers, more inventors, more of everything. When agricultural societies encountered hunter-gatherer communities, the farmers usually prevailed simply through greater numbers, even if individual hunter-gatherers were healthier or more skilled warriors. Over millennia, agriculture spread across most of the world where the climate allowed. This expansion occurred through migration, with farming peoples displacing or absorbing hunter-gatherers, and through adoption, as hunter-gatherers learned farming techniques from their neighbors. This transition from mobile hunting and gathering to settled farming laid the groundwork for complex civilizations. Permanent settlements evolved into cities, which in turn required food from surrounding agricultural regions, leading to the development of trade networks. The need for trade spurred record-keeping, which independently led to the invention of writing in multiple regions. Complex societies developed hierarchies, with rulers, priests, craftspeople, farmers, and even slaves forming distinct social classes. Organized religion gained prominence, marked by monumental architecture like temples and pyramids built to honor gods or rulers. Specialized occupations emerged as individuals focused on pottery, metalworking, weaving, or administration rather than food production. The first civilizations arose in river valleys where agriculture thrived. Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley in South Asia, the Yellow River in China. These civilizations developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, all the hallmarks of complex societies. And all of this unfolded within just a few thousand years after the end of the last ice age. The transformation from small, mobile, hunter-gatherer bands to cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants is remarkably rapid. It's important to remember that even as these civilizations flourished, hunter-gatherer societies continued to thrive in other parts of the world. Australia's Aboriginal peoples maintained their traditional lifestyles for tens of thousands of years after agriculture's invention elsewhere. In the Americas, many groups remained hunter-gatherers, even as others developed agriculture and built cities. In Africa, groups like the San people successfully hunted and gathered until very recently, and some still do. Agriculture wasn't inevitable or universally adopted. It was just one strategy among many, one that happened to be very successful at supporting large populations and complex societies, but not the only viable way to live. The ecological consequences of this transition were profound. It wasn't just about the extinction of megafauna. Forests expanded dramatically, reshaping countless ecosystems. Species adapted to open grasslands had to move, adapt, or face extinction. Cold-adapted species retreated northward or to higher elevations, while warm-adapted species expanded their ranges. The distribution of species across the planet shifted massively within just a few thousand years. Humans increasingly shaped these ecosystems, often in ways we didn't fully understand until recently. Indigenous peoples around the world used fire as a landscape management tool, burning regularly to maintain open areas that attracted game animals or promoted the growth of useful plants. This burning had huge effects on vegetation patterns. What we often perceive as natural, pristine ecosystems are, in many cases, anthropogenic, shaped by thousands of years of human fire management. In Australia, Aboriginal burning transformed vast areas from dense forest to open woodland and grassland. In North America, Native American burning maintained prairies and savannas that might otherwise have become forested. When Europeans arrived and disrupted these burning practices, ecosystems often shifted dramatically. Forests grew where they hadn't been for millennia, fire-adapted species declined, and fire-sensitive species increased. The wilderness Europeans encountered wasn't untouched nature. It was often the result of thousands of years of active human management. The extinction of megafauna also had cascading ecological effects that we are still working to understand. Mega herbivores like mammoths weren't just eating plants. They were ecosystem engineers. They knocked down trees, maintained open areas, distributed nutrients through their dung, and created trails and wallows. When they disappeared, these functions disappeared too. Some scientists believe that forests expanded after the Ice Age, partly because there were no longer giant herbivores to suppress tree growth. There's even a hypothesis that megafauna extinction contributed to climate change. Large herbivores produce a significant amount of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, through their digestive systems. When megafauna populations crashed, methane emissions may have decreased significantly. Additionally, the transformation from open grasslands to forests altered the reflectivity of the land surface, affecting how much solar energy was absorbed versus reflected. The loss of those massive creatures, the megafauna, it affected us too. For thousands of years, humans had relied on them for survival. It wasn't just the food, it was the materials. I've often wondered about the ingenuity that came from necessity. Mammoth ivory became tools, art, construction material. Hides were clothing and shelter. Bones, needles, dwelling frameworks, everything. The disappearance of the megafauna forced us to find substitutes, and that probably drove technological innovations. In a way, their extinction might have accelerated the transition to agriculture in some regions. If your primary food source vanishes and you can't replace it by hunting smaller game, you either starve or find a new way. Agriculture became that way. Those extinctions that ended the Ice Age world might have inadvertently pushed humans toward the lifestyles that would create modern civilization. The Holocene, the time since the last Ice Age, has been unusually stable compared to the climate fluctuations of the Pleistocene. There have been variations, warm periods and cold periods, droughts and floods, but nothing like the dramatic swings of the Ice Age with its rapid warming and cooling events. This stability probably helped civilizations develop. It's difficult to build cities and plan agriculture when the climate might flip dramatically within a generation. But Holocene stability let humans make long-term plans and investments, building irrigation systems and monumental architecture that took decades or centuries to complete. Different parts of the world experienced the Holocene differently. The Sahara Desert, now a vast empty wasteland, was actually green and wet during the early Holocene. From about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, increased monsoon activity brought more rain to North Africa. Rivers flowed through what's now desert. Lakes filled valleys. Vegetation covered areas that are now bare sand. People lived throughout the region, herding cattle and developing agriculture. Rock art from this period shows hippos, giraffes, elephants, animals that now seem impossibly out of place. But then, around 5,000 years ago, the African monsoons weakened, and the Sahara dried out relatively rapidly. Within just a few centuries, the Green Sahara became the desert we know. This desertification forced populations to migrate, many moving to the Nile Valley, where water remained available. Some historians think this migration and concentration along the Nile contributed to the development of ancient Egyptian civilization. Climate change, driving human migration, driving civilization development, all interconnected. Similar stories played out elsewhere. The Middle East was relatively wet in the early Holocene, supporting agriculture and early civilizations. but droughts have repeatedly stressed or collapsed civilizations. In Mesoamerica, droughts have been linked to the collapse of Maya civilization. In the American Southwest, extended droughts forced abandonment of settlements like Mesa Verde. Climate variability during the Holocene has been a constant factor shaping human history, even though the swings were mild compared to the Ice Age. And here we are now, roughly 11,700 years into the current interglacial. Based on past interglacials, we should eventually slide back into glacial conditions at some point. Different models give different predictions. Some suggest we have thousands of years before the next glaciation begins. Others think tens of thousands of years. The orbital cycles are complex, and their effects don't always line up predictably. But there's a massive wild card now. Human activity is affecting global climate on a scale that might override the natural cycles entirely. We've increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from the natural interglacial level of about 280 parts per million to over 420 parts per million. That's a 50% increase in just a couple of centuries. The ice core records going back 800,000 years show nothing like this. We're in completely uncharted territory. And this brings us to the big question: what happens next? So here's where things get really interesting and honestly a bit scary. We've spent this whole time talking about how the 100,000-year cycle has controlled Earth's climate for millions of years, creating ice ages and shaping the evolution of life, including humans. But now, for the first time in the history of this cycle, one species has the power to override it, and that species is us. Some scientists think we've already delayed or canceled the next glaciation. The extra carbon dioxide we've pumped into the atmosphere warming the planet, making it unlikely that Northern Hemisphere summers will be cool enough to allow ice sheet formation, even when the orbital cycles shift toward glacial conditions. We might have prevented the next ice age from ever happening. Sounds good, right? Nobody wants kilometers of ice covering Canada and Scandinavia again. But the problem is, we're not just preventing the next ice age, we're warming the planet way beyond normal interglacial conditions. And we're doing it incredibly fast. Let's talk about what we learned from studying ice age cycles and why it matters right now. First, and most importantly, the climate system has tipping points. It's not linear or gradual. You can push the system for a while and see only small changes, then suddenly cross a threshold and boom, rapid dramatic shifts happen. The Younger Dryas is the perfect example. Gradual warming, then catastrophic freshwater flooding, then abrupt climate reversal within decades. The system flipped states faster than human lifetimes. We're seeing similar threshold behavior today in multiple parts of the climate. Ice sheets don't melt in a way that is uniform or predictable. I've learned that they can remain stable for incredibly long stretches, only to suddenly accelerate their melting when they reach certain critical points. It's a delicate balance, and one that we are disrupting. Ocean circulation patterns, like the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, can weaken gradually, then potentially shut down with surprising speed. Permafrost, frozen for millennia, can abruptly thaw, unleashing greenhouse gases that further amplify the warming. These aren't smooth transitions. Small changes can trigger enormous responses. And the unsettling truth is, we're pushing multiple systems toward these tipping points at the same time. Arctic sea ice is declining dramatically. Since satellite measurements began in the 1970s, the minimum extent in summer has dropped by about 40%. Some models even suggest we could see ice-free Arctic summers within decades. And this brings us back to those feedback loops. Ice reflects sunlight, while ocean water absorbs it. Less ice means more heat absorption, leading to more warming and ultimately more ice loss. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. The Greenland ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate, around 250 billion tons per year, according to our recent measurements. If it all melted, Greenland holds enough ice to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters. While nobody expects it to vanish entirely anytime soon, even losing a fraction of it over the coming centuries would have a massive impact on coastlines worldwide. And once major melting begins, the feedback effects make it incredibly difficult to stop. Exposed, darker rock absorbs more heat. Meltwater lubricates the ice base, causing it to flow faster. Warm ocean water gets underneath, melting the ice from below. These are all positive feedbacks, amplifying the initial change. The West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly concerning because much of it rests on bedrock below sea level. Warm ocean water is already making its way underneath, causing melting. Some scientists believe that major portions of it might be destined to collapse over the coming centuries, even if we were to stop warming today. If that happens, we could be looking at 3 to 5 meters of sea level rise. This would reshape coastlines across the globe and displace hundreds of millions of people. The carbon cycle is being disrupted in ways that mirror the Ice Age cycles, but reversed and at a much faster pace. During glacial periods, carbon dioxide levels dropped to around 180 to 200 parts per million. During interglacial periods, they rose to about 280 to 300 parts per million. This roughly 100 parts per million swing took tens of thousands of years, driven by natural ocean and vegetation processes. We've increased carbon dioxide by over 140 parts per million in just over a century. We're replicating the natural cycle's entire range in a tiny fraction of the time. We're blowing past natural interglacial levels, venturing into territory Earth hasn't seen for millions of years. The last time carbon dioxide levels were this high was probably during the Pliocene epoch, around 3 million years ago. Back then, temperatures were several degrees warmer than they are today. Sea levels were 15 to 25 meters higher, and the Arctic was forested instead of ice-covered. That's where we're headed if we don't change course. And the rate of change matters just as much as the magnitude. Ecosystems can adapt to gradual changes over thousands of years. Species migrate, evolution selects for new traits, and ecological communities reassemble. But when change happens in decades or centuries, there's no time for gradual adaptation. Species either move fast enough or they face extinction. We're already seeing range shift in thousands of species. Plants are flowering earlier, animals are moving toward the poles or up mountains, and ocean species are shifting to cooler waters. Some species are adapting successfully, while others are not, and we're likely headed for another extinction wave. It might not be as dramatic as the megafauna extinctions of the past, but it will still be significant. Current extinction rates are already elevated above background levels, and climate change is adding another major stressor on top of habitat loss and pollution. Here's something that keeps scientists up at night. During ice age cycles, carbon dioxide changes were a feedback, not a forcing. Orbital variations changed sunlight distribution. This affected temperature. Temperature changes affected ocean chemistry and vegetation, which changed atmospheric carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then amplified the temperature changes. It was a feedback loop within the system, responding to external astronomical forcing. But what we're doing is different. We're directly forcing carbon dioxide changes by burning fossil fuels. This is direct forcing, not feedback. And all those natural feedbacks that amplified carbon dioxide changes during ice age cycles are still operating. They're amplifying the changes we're causing. We're pushing on a system with built-in amplifiers, and we don't fully understand all of them or where the thresholds lie. Permafrost is a huge wild card. There's around 1,500 billion tons of organic carbon stored in frozen Arctic soils. That's roughly twice as much carbon as currently exists in the atmosphere. As the Arctic warms, permafrost thaws, and microbes start decomposing that organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. It's a classic feedback loop. Warming causes thawing. Thawing releases greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases cause more warming. How fast this happens is uncertain, but the potential for permafrost to become a major additional carbon source is real and truly scary. The ocean has absorbed about 90% of the extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases so far. This has slowed atmospheric warming, but at the cost of warming the ocean itself. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen. We're already seeing expanding dead zones where oxygen levels have dropped too low to support most life. Marine organisms are stressed by warming, acidification from dissolved carbon dioxide, and oxygen loss simultaneously. Coral reefs are being devastated by repeated bleaching events. These ecosystems, which support enormous biodiversity, are collapsing. I find myself thinking about future geologists, millions of years from now. What will they make of the sediments they unearth from our time? They'll see the mark of massive carbon combustion, extinction signatures, and the strange new materials we've created, plastics and concrete embedded in the earth. They'll recognize that something unprecedented happened during this brief moment in Earth's history. The question is, will they also find evidence that we navigated the crisis? That's still an open question, and the answer depends on what we do in the coming decades. Even as the globe warms, there's a chance that some areas, like parts of Europe, could experience regional cooling if the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation weakens or shuts down. It's a paradox, really. Global warming causing regional cooling. Climate is more complicated and counterintuitive than we often realize. Understanding the 100,000-year cycle teaches us a crucial lesson. Earth's climate is incredibly sensitive to even small changes. The orbital variations that trigger ice ages are, in the grand scheme of things, tiny changes in seasonal sunlight. Yet, combined with feedback loops, they're enough to tip the system from one state to another. Now, we're applying forcing that's much larger and faster than those orbital variations. The response will be substantial. It's just a question of how substantial and on what time scale. Climate has momentum. Ice sheets, for example, take thousands of years to grow, but they can collapse much faster. Once major melting begins, stopping it becomes incredibly difficult. Ocean circulation changes can be hard to reverse. Some of the changes we're causing are essentially irreversible on human timescales. Even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, temperatures would remain elevated for centuries as the ocean and atmosphere slowly reach equilibrium. Sea levels would continue rising for centuries or even millennia as ice sheets keep responding to the warming that's already in motion. It's uncomfortable to think about, but we've probably already committed to significant changes, even with aggressive emission reductions. Some warming, some sea level rise, and some ecosystem disruption are already baked in, as they say. The real question is how much more we add. Every bit of additional warming makes things worse. Every tenth of a degree matters when you're dealing with systems that have tipping points. The paleoclimate record is clear. Rapid climate change is incredibly hard on societies. Climate changes at the end of the Ice Age contributed to megafauna extinctions and forced major changes in how humans subsisted. Droughts during the Holocene toppled civilizations, and those were natural variations that societies had no control over. We're causing changes that are potentially faster and larger than those natural variations. With over 8 billion people to feed and house, many in areas vulnerable to climate change, the implications are staggering. Coastal cities face flooding from sea level rise. Agricultural regions face shifting rainfall patterns and more extreme weather. Water resources are stressed by changing precipitation and glacial melt. Tropical regions could see temperatures exceeding human survivability thresholds for outdoor work during heat waves. Island nations could literally disappear. The humanitarian implications are enormous and unequally distributed. Those who contributed least to causing climate change are often the most vulnerable to its effects. But understanding the problem is the first step toward addressing it. We know more about climate now than ever before. We can see changes happening in real time with satellites and monitoring. We can model future scenarios with increasing accuracy. And we have technologies available that could dramatically reduce emissions if deployed at scale. Solar and wind are now cost competitive with fossil fuels in many places. Electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. Energy storage is improving. Carbon capture is being developed, though it's not yet proven at the necessary scale. The challenge isn't really technological anymore. It's political, economic, and social. Getting 8 billion people to coordinate on emission reductions, equitably distributing costs and benefits, and navigating competing interests. That's the hard part. Climate change is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. Individual actors benefit from burning fossil fuels, but everyone suffers the consequences. Solving it requires collective action at a scale humanity has never achieved. Some people feel despair. The problem seems too big, change is too slow, obstacles too numerous. I understand that feeling. But humans have navigated existential challenges before. We survived the Ice Age through adaptation and innovation. We transitioned from hunting megafauna to agriculture, fundamentally transforming our relationship with the planet. We've overcome diseases, expanded lifespans, and created technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We're not helpless. We're just facing a problem that requires unprecedented coordination. The 100,000-year cycle will eventually resume, assuming we don't permanently alter it. The orbital mechanics haven't changed. Naturally, Earth would eventually slide back into glacial conditions tens of thousands of years from now. But we're writing a new chapter, one where human activity is a major climate driver, not just a responder. We're affecting the planet on a scale comparable to the astronomical forces that controlled climate for millions of years. No species has ever had this influence. It's both inspiring and terrifying. We're living through a moment unlike any other in Earth's 4.5 billion years. Never before has a single species understood the global climate system while simultaneously altering it. The knowledge and the power we possess are unprecedented. What we choose to do with that power will determine Earth's trajectory for thousands, even millions of years. The Ice Age cycles have shown us that life is remarkably resilient. Earth has endured dramatic climate shifts, and life has always found a way to survive, adapt, and even thrive. It survived the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, it survived ice ages, and it will survive this. But the real question isn't whether life will survive, but whether human civilization as we know it will thrive, or whether we'll face disruptions that could have been avoided. I began this exploration by talking about the mystery of the 100,000-year cycle. Now, the same scientific community that solved that mystery is warning us about anthropogenic climate change, employing the very same methods that revealed the Ice Age cycles to begin with. If we trust the science that explained the past, shouldn't we trust its predictions for the future? And it's quite clear that we're pushing the climate system hard. We will see significant responses, and the window for avoiding the worst outcomes is rapidly closing. The Ice Age taught our ancestors to be adaptable and innovative. That's in our DNA. We can use those traits to navigate the challenge we've created, but we need to act collectively and quickly. The climate system has momentum and time lags. Actions we take today won't show their full effects for decades. But inaction today commits us to changes that will unfold for centuries. Every year of delay only makes the eventual response harder and more disruptive. So, where does that leave us? We're 11,700 years into an interglacial period that should eventually come to an end. We are armed with an understanding of how climate works, and we are actively changing it faster than natural processes typically do. The 100,000-year cycle that shaped human evolution is now being overridden by human activity. We've become a geological force. The only question is whether we use that power wisely or recklessly. The answer to that question will determine what kind of planet future generations inherit, and whether they'll view us as ancestors who rose to the challenge or as a cautionary tale of a species that understood the problem but failed to act. The clock is ticking. The cycle that sustained life for millions of years is still operating in the background. But for the first time, it might not matter, because for the first time, one of the species it created has the power to override it. And what we do with that power in the next few decades will determine not just our future, but the future of countless other species sharing this planet with us. The Ice Age is over. The question is, what comes next? And unlike our ancestors who just had to survive the cycle, we have the power to shape it. That's both an incredible responsibility and an incredible opportunity. Time to see what we do with it.